The thunderous roar of 10,000 shells crashes against concrete as machine gunner Heinrich Müller presses his face against the firing slit, watching American bodies tumble like broken dolls in the surf below. The fate of Europe, and perhaps the entire war, now hinges on whether 50,000 German defenders can throw back the largest seaborne invasion in human history. For the men trapped in bunkers along Hitler's Atlantic Wall, the next few hours will determine if the Third Reich survives another year or crumbles into the sea it once ruled. The stench of cordite burns Heinrich's nostrils as he squeezes another burst from his MG42. Sweat stings his eyes. The concrete beneath his boots trembles with each naval shell impact 1,000-pound projectiles that shake the earth like the footsteps of giants. Through the acrid smoke, he glimpses the impossible, the English Channel running black with ships stretching to the horizon, 4,000 vessels, maybe more. His stomach drops. This is no diversionary raid. 20 kilometers inland, Adolf Hitler sleeps peacefully in his Bavarian retreat. It's 10 o'clock on the morning of June 6, 1944. And the Führer has given strict orders not to be disturbed before his customary late rising. His staff pace nervously in the corridors of the Berghof, clutching intercepted radio reports of massive Allied landings in Normandy, but they dare not wake him. The man who controls the fate of 15 Panzer divisions scattered across France continues to dream while his soldiers die. Field Marshal Rommel, the Desert Fox himself, chose the worst possible moment for a romantic gesture. Yesterday, convinced that stormy weather made Allied landings impossible, he drove to Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday. The Atlantic Wall's architect now races through the German countryside in his staff car, desperate to reach his headquarters as his life's work crumbles without him. Heinrich's machine gun falls silent. The barrel glows cherry red, too hot to touch. Steam rises as he relieves himself on the overheated metal, the only way to cool it quickly. Around him, his comrades work frantically to feed ammunition belts into their weapons. The smell of hot metal mixes with urine and concrete dust. Through the narrow firing slit, the nightmare continues. Wave after wave of landing craft grinding onto the beaches, disgorging soldiers who stumble through the surf toward his position. What Heinrich doesn't know, what no German soldier along the coast knows, is that their commanders expected this invasion to come elsewhere. The Calais deception worked perfectly. Even now, as real American boots splash through Norman tide pools, Hitler's staff believes the true assault will strike 200 kilometers north. 15 entire divisions wait uselessly in the Pas de Calais, guarding empty beaches while the fate of the war unfolds here. The German 7th Army's phone lines went dead hours ago. Allied bombers systematically severed communications cables, leaving isolated bunker commanders to fight blind. No orders, no reinforcements, no hope of coordinated defense. Each strongpoint becomes its own miniature Alamo. But here's what the Allied planners didn't expect. The 352nd Infantry Division, 7,500 battle-hardened veterans from the Eastern Front, twice the strength intelligence reports suggested. They've turned Omaha Beach into a killing field that will soon earn the name Bloody Omaha. Heinrich and his comrades represent Hitler's greatest tactical surprise troops who weren't supposed to be here, manning positions the Allies thought lightly defended. A Luftwaffe pilot radios from somewhere over the channel. Mein Gott, the sea is black with ships. Only 2 German planes will fly over Normandy today. 2. The Allies launched 11,000 sorties at dawn. The mathematical reality hits like a physical blow. They are alone. In his bunker at Point du Hoc, artillery commander Klaus Weber peers through his periscope at the most beautiful and terrifying sight of his life. The morning sun catches the spray from 1,000 propellers as Allied aircraft swarm overhead like metallic locusts. The 155mm French guns behind him, captured prizes from 1940, sit ready under their concrete casemates. But Weber knows what his superiors refuse to acknowledge. They're not fighting an invasion. They're fighting an avalanche. Picture yourself in Heinrich's boots, the concrete shaking beneath your feet, the acrid smoke burning your throat, the impossible armada stretching beyond the horizon. Would you hold your position? Or would the sheer scale of Allied power break your resolve before the first American reached your wire? As Heinrich watches the first American soldiers reach the seawall below his bunker, a terrible realization dawns. The bodies in the surf aren't stopping the landing, they're just the beginning. But will Germany's scattered Panzer reserves arrive in time to drive the invaders back into the sea, or has the Third Reich already lost the war in the first hour of the longest day? Generals gamble. Oberst Friedrich Ziegler tears the field telephone from his ear as another Allied shell obliterates the communication bunker 200 meters away, the explosion showering his command post with chunks of concrete and the metallic taste of pulverized stone. The German High Command's fatal split over tank deployment, beach defense versus mobile reserve now plays out in real time as isolated commanders make life-or-death decisions without orders from above. Every choice in the next few hours will either save the Reich or seal its doom. Ziegler wipes blood from a shrapnel cut on his cheek and peers through his periscope. The sight defies belief. American soldiers advancing up the bluff in disciplined lines, their wet uniforms steaming in the morning sun. Behind them, the beach writhes with movement, more landing craft, more troops, an endless stream of humanity pouring from the sea. The smell of sulfur and burnt flesh drifts through his bunker's ventilation system. Field Marshal Rommel had predicted this exact scenario months ago, tank close to the beaches. He'd argued with increasing desperation. Station the Panzers, where they can counterattack within hours, not days. But Field Marshal von Rundstedt disagreed. Keep the armor inland, mass it for one decisive blow. Hitler, in his infinite wisdom, chose both strategies, which meant choosing neither. The compromise doomed them all. Panzer divisions scattered across France like chess pieces on different boards. The 21st Panzer, near Caen, Panzer far to the south. The 12th SS Hitlerjugend held in reserve, waiting for permission that might never come. Each division strong enough to matter, none positioned to win. At 4 in the afternoon, Lieutenant Colonel Hans Opperlein Bronikowski finally receives the order his tankers have waited for all day. The 21st Panzer Division will counterattack toward the coast. His crews scramble into their vehicles, Mark IV Panzers with long-barreled 75mm guns, the workhorses of the Wehrmacht. But as his column rumbles north toward the British beaches, Opperlein Bronikowski spots movement in the sky that makes his blood freeze. Allied fighter bombers circle overhead like hawks over a wheat field. Typhoons and thunderbolts diving, climbing, diving again. Their rockets streak toward his lead tanks with trails of white smoke. The 1st Panzer erupts in orange flame, its turrets spinning through the air like a discus. Then the 2nd, the 3rd. The Desert Fox had warned them. The enemy has complete command of the air. They will bomb and strafe our columns continuously. Moving by daylight meant suicide. But what choice did they have? By nightfall, the Allies would be too deeply entrenched to dislodge. Opperlein Bronikowski orders his surviving tanks to scatter, seeking cover in Norman farmyards and beneath overhanging trees. The counterattack that should have started at dawn, the massed armour charge that might have driven the British back into the sea, sputters to a halt under the weight of Allied air power. History will record that the 21st Panzer reached the coast briefly that evening, pushing between British and Canadian landing zones. What it won't record is the terror in his crew's eyes as they realised they were alone. Meanwhile, Panzer Lehr Division, over 200 tanks commanded by General Fritz Bayerlein, begins its trek from positions south of the Loire River. Bayerlein knows his division represents Germany's last hope for a meaningful counterattack. These are veteran crews with the Reich's best equipment. But they face a 100-kilometre journey under open skies swarming with Allied aircraft. The first air attack comes at sunset. British Typhoons sweep in low, their 20mm cannons raking the column. Bayerlein watches helplessly as fuel trucks explode in mushroom clouds of black smoke. Ammunition carriers detonate like fireworks, their contents scattered across Norman wheat fields. By dawn, his division will have lost 60 tanks without firing a shot at the enemy. But perhaps the cruelest irony unfolds at Hitler's headquarters. Staff officers finally wake the Führer at 10 in the morning, briefing him on the scale of Allied landings. Hitler's response? Confidence bordering on glee. So they've finally come, he declares. Now we can destroy them. He authorizes the release of exactly 1 Panzer division, a single armored formation to counter the largest invasion in history. The man who conquered France in 6 weeks, who nearly captured Moscow, who once possessed the strategic insight to revolutionize warfare that man seems absent from the Berghof on June 6th. In his place sits a delusional figure, convinced that Operation Fortitude's Phantom Army Group in southeastern England poses the real threat. 15 divisions wait uselessly around Calais, while the actual invasion tears gaping holes in the Atlantic Wall. German artillery crews at Lons-sur-Mer provide a brief moment of defiance. Their casemates house captured French guns, 155mm cannons that can reach Allied ships 12 kilometers offshore. The battery commander, Major Wilhelm Pluskat, watches through his rangefinder as Allied cruisers and destroyers steam back and forth, methodically pounding German positions. Range 11,000 meters, he calls out. Fire for effect. The guns roar, their muzzle flashes illuminating the concrete walls. Through binoculars, Pluscat watches his shells splash near a British cruiser. Close, very close. For a few precious minutes, German guns trade punches with the Royal Navy on equal terms. Then the return fire arrives. Naval shells weighing as much as small automobiles crash into the battery position. Concrete fragments fill the air like deadly confetti. The smell of explosive fills Pluscat's nostrils, mixed with the copper scent of blood from wounded gunners. After firing 184 shells, the battery falls silent. But the Major walks calmly from his shattered bunker, sword drawn in formal surrender, a moment of dignity amid the chaos. Could you have maintained such composure, watching your life's work crumble under the weight of Allied firepower, knowing that help would never come? As night falls on June 6, the scattered pieces of Germany's armoured reserve finally lumber toward Normandy, too late, too few, and under skies controlled by the enemy. The question hanging over every German commander is simple. Will Hitler's divided strategy cost them the war? Or can scattered acts of heroism somehow snatch victory from the jaws of defeat? Section 3. The Forgotten Army. Corporal Dmitry Volkov crouches in a German uniform that hangs loose on his malnourished frame, clutching a Czech rifle, while Allied shells whistle overhead, a Soviet prisoner of war turned reluctant Wehrmacht defender who never imagined he'd die fighting Americans on a French beach. The Atlantic Wall's dirty secret wasn't German engineering or tactical brilliance. It was desperation, made manifest through pressed men from a dozen conquered nations, many of whom would rather surrender than fight for the Reich that enslaved them. This motley garrison would determine whether Hitler's fortress Europe stood or fell. Volkov flinches as another naval shell explodes 50 meters away, showering his foxhole with sand and debris. The acrid smell of high explosive burns his nostrils. Through the smoke, he watches his section leader, a grizzled German sergeant from Bavaria, shouting orders in a language half the men barely understand. Polish conscripts huddle in nearby positions, their faces pale with terror. A Czech machine gunner methodically feeds belt ammunition into his weapon, muttering prayers in a language the Germans forbade him to speak. The 716th Static Infantry Division defending Sword Beach represents everything wrong with Hitler's Atlantic Wall. Conscripts from annexed territories, Volksdeutsche, born outside Germany who struggle with basic commands, Eastern Europeans pressed into service at gunpoint. They carry obsolete Czech weapons, wear uniforms patched with newspaper, and subsist on rations of black bread and ersatz coffee that tastes like burnt acorns. Some fight with unexpected ferocity. Others surrender at the first opportunity, raising white cloths torn from their shirts. Volkov watches a group of Poles throw down their weapons and walk toward the British landing craft, hands raised high. Their German officer screams at them to return to their positions, his voice cracking with desperation. They don't look back, but scattered among these reluctant warriors stand formations that strike fear into Allied hearts. The 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend 17 and 18-year-old fanatics who learned warfare from Hitler Youth rallies and Eastern Front veterans. They sleep on the ground rather than in barracks, train with live ammunition, and consider death in battle the highest honor. Their motto, flexible like leather, tough like Krupp steel, swift like greyhounds. These teenage soldiers represent National Socialism's final gamble, a generation raised on propaganda, hardened by war, and convinced that defeat means Germany's extinction. They march toward Normandy singing the Horst Wessel song, their faces bright with zealous determination. Many carry Hitler Youth armbands sewn onto their SS uniforms, as if childhood and death march hand in hand. Lieutenant Hans Müller of the Hitlerjugend leads his platoon through Norman hedgerows that will earn the name Green Hell. The bocage country ancient field boundaries topped with thick vegetation turns every meadow into a fortress, every farm lane into a killing ground. Müller's boys, barely old enough to shave, set up ambush positions behind stone walls covered in centuries of ivy. Their weapons tell a different story than the threadbare garrison troops. MG-42 machine guns, Hitler's buzzsaw that fire 1,200 rounds per minute with a sound like ripping canvas. Panzerfaust, anti-tank weapons that can penetrate Allied armour at 30 metres. Rifle grenades and steel hand granaten that turn Norman farmyards into explosive mazes. The first British tanks rumble down a country lane toward Müller's position. Sherman Fireflies with 17-pounder guns that can kill any German tank. But in the bocage, range doesn't matter. Müller waits until the lead tank reaches a gap in the hedgerow, then signals his Panzerfaust gunner. The shaped charge warhead punches through the Sherman's side armour like paper, Orange flame erupts from the crew hatches as ammunition cooks off inside. More tanks push forward. Müller's machine gunner, a boy named Klaus who lied about his age to join the SS, opens fire from a concealed position. His MG-42 cuts down British infantry attempting to advance around their burning tanks. The sharp crack of rifle fire echoes across the hedgerows as his squad engages targets at ranges under 50 meters. This is warfare stripped to its essence, not grand strategy or technological superiority, but young men killing each other at spitting distance in a landscape that favors the defender. Every field becomes Thermopylae. Every farmhouse becomes a fortress. But the Hitlerjugend's fanaticism comes with a terrible cost. They refuse to take prisoners, executing wounded Allied soldiers rather than evacuating them. British and Canadian forces respond in kind. The Bocage warfare degenerates into a series of small-scale massacres where teenagers commit atrocities their grandfathers would have found unthinkable. Meanwhile, German supply lines collapse under relentless air attack. Fuel shortages strand entire panzer formations. Ammunition runs low as Allied fighter bombers destroy every convoy moving by daylight. The soldiers manning Hitler's Atlantic Wall fight with whatever they can scavenge from French farms, eggs, wine, and bread looted from abandoned houses. In bunker after bunker, German defenders face an agonizing choice: hold position until overwhelmed or abandon their posts and face court-martial for desertion. Many choose a third option, fighting until their ammunition runs out, then surrendering with hands raised and consciences clear. The smell of cordite, concrete dust, and death permeates every German position. Wounded soldiers scream for medics who carry little more than iodine and field dressings. Morphine disappeared from medical supplies months ago. Men die in agony, calling for mothers they'll never see again. Yet somehow, this patchwork army of teenagers, conscripts, and fanatics holds, not through superior equipment or brilliant tactics, but through desperate courage and the simple fact that retreat means certain death, either from Allied bullets or German firing squads. Would you have stood with Dmitry Volkov in his foxhole, fighting for a cause you despised, or joined the Poles walking toward enemy lines with hands raised high? As night falls on the 6th of June, the German garrison faces a terrible mathematics: 50,000 defenders against 150,000 Allied invaders, with more ships arriving every hour. But in the hedgerows of Normandy, numbers don't always determine victory. Sometimes, a handful of boys with machine guns can hold back an army. Section 4. Hitler's Bunker Madness. General Alfred Jodl clutches the latest casualty reports with trembling hands as Hitler paces the Berghoff's map room, his face flushed with rage, screaming that the Normandy landings are merely a feint, while the real invasion waits to strike at Calais. The fate of the Third Reich now rests in the hands of a man who has lost touch with military reality, convinced that his intuition trumps the desperate pleas of commanders, watching their divisions disintegrate under Allied bombardment. While German soldiers die by the thousands on Norman beaches, the Führer wages war against phantom armies that exist only in his imagination. The smell of strong coffee and cigarette smoke fills the conference room as Hitler's staff officers exchange worried glances. The latest reports paint a nightmare scenario: Allied forces streaming inland from 5 separate beachheads, German communications severed, Panzer reserves scattered and paralyzed by air attacks. Yet Hitler dismisses each briefing with an impatient wave, his attention fixed on the Pas de Calais, where he expects General Patton's fictional army group to materialize. "They want us to commit our reserves to Normandy," Hitler declares, stabbing the map with his finger. "But I know better. This is exactly what Eisenhower wants, to draw our strength away from the real target." His voice rises to a shout that echoes through the Alpine retreat. "The invasion will come at Calais, mark my words." Operation Fortitude, the Allied deception campaign, has achieved something beyond the wildest dreams of British intelligence officers. They haven't just fooled Hitler, they've created a strategic paralysis that infects the entire German command structure. 15 divisions sit idle in the north, while the actual invasion tears holes in the Atlantic Wall. The phantom threat of a second landing keeps Germany's most powerful reserves frozen in place like pieces on a chessboard where only one player can see the game. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt tries desperately to inject reality into the proceedings. His weathered face, scarred by decades of warfare, betrays his frustration as he presents intercepts of Allied radio traffic, reconnaissance reports, and first-hand accounts from the front. Everything points to Normandy as the main effort, but Hitler's response remains unchanged. This is a diversion. The real blow comes later. The human cost of this delusion becomes clear as reports arrive from individual units. The 352nd Infantry Division, 7,000 men defending Omaha Beach, ceases to exist as an organized formation within 12 hours. The 716th Static Division disintegrates under British assault. Entire battalions vanish from radio contact, their final transmissions desperate pleas for reinforcements that will never come. Hitler's military conferences take on an increasingly surreal quality. While German survivors struggle through Norman hedgerows under constant air attack, the Führer debates phantom landing craft massing in Dover. While Panzer crews burn in their tanks, he discusses imaginary threats to Norwegian fjords. The man who once possessed an intuitive grasp of military operations now inhabits a fantasy world where his wishes override battlefield reality. General Wilhelm Keitel, nicknamed La Keitel, the lackey, by his peers for his servile obedience, nods agreement with every delusional pronouncement. Yes, Führer, Normandy is clearly a feint. Yes, Führer, the enemy seeks to draw our reserves away from Calais. The atmosphere in the Berghof becomes toxic with sycophancy and wishful thinking, while real soldiers face real bullets 500 kilometers away. But Hitler's delusions serve another purpose. They provide psychological cover for a mind unwilling to confront the possibility of defeat. To acknowledge Normandy as the main invasion means accepting that Germany lacks the strength to repel it. The phantom armies at Calais offer hope. If the real landing hasn't happened yet, there's still time to win. Meanwhile, German propaganda broadcasts paint an alternate reality for home front consumption. Radio announcers describe successful repulse of enemy landing attempts, while British bombers systematically destroy German positions. Goebbels' ministry churns out reports of heavy Allied casualties technically true, but meaningless in context. When you land 150,000 men and lose 8,000, you've achieved a stunning victory. When you defend with 50,000 and lose 20,000, you've suffered catastrophic defeat. The disconnect between Berlin's pronouncements and battlefield reality reaches absurd proportions. German newspapers trumpet, "Fortress Europe holds firm," while refugees stream inland from the Norman coast. Radio broadcasts celebrate heroic resistance to invasion attempts, while German generals burn their maps and prepare for retreat. Hitler's refusal to release the 12th SS Panzer Hitlerjugend until late evening on June 6th provides the most damning example of strategic paralysis. This elite division, over 15,000 fanatical young warriors with modern equipment, could have counterattacked the Canadian landing zones, while Allied forces remained vulnerable on the beaches. Instead, they march north when the moment for decisive intervention has already passed. The bureaucratic machinery of the Third Reich compounds every delay. Orders must flow through multiple command levels, each afraid to act without explicit authorization from above. Local commanders, who might have improvised effective responses, wait for permission that arrives too late or never comes at all. Initiative, the German army's greatest strength in earlier campaigns, withers under the weight of Hitler's centralized control. By evening on June 6th, the pattern becomes clear. Germany will fight the next phase of the war with forces committed piecemeal, always one step behind Allied movements, always reacting rather than seizing initiative. The strategic surprise that won France in 1940 has been reversed. Now the Allies hold the initiative while German forces stumble through a campaign fought according to Hitler's fantasies rather than military reality. Can you imagine being a German staff officer in that room, watching your Führer dismiss reports of disaster as enemy deception while your army bleeds to death in Norman fields? As midnight approaches on the longest day, Hitler finally retires to his private quarters, confident that he has seen through Allied deception and kept Germany's reserves positioned for the real invasion that will never come. But outside his Alpine fortress, the Wehrmacht begins a retreat that will end only at the gates of Berlin. Section 5. Blood in the Bocage. Gefreiter Klaus Weber presses his eye to the MG-42's sight as a British Sherman tank crashes through the hedgerow 30 meters away, its steel tracks churning Norman earth into bloody mud while his finger tightens on the trigger that will decide whether he lives to see another sunrise. The hedgerow country of Normandy, ancient field boundaries that farmers built over centuries, now becomes Germany's last hope for stopping the Allied breakout, transforming every meadow into a killing field where teenage Wehrmacht soldiers can ambush entire armored columns. But this green maze cuts both ways, trapping defenders as effectively as it channels attackers. The MG-42 hammers against Weber's shoulder as he sweeps the gun across advancing British infantry. Empty brass casings cascade from the weapon like metallic rain, their sharp smell mixing with cordite smoke and the sweet stench of summer grass torn by shrapnel. Through his peripheral vision, he glimpses Führer Hoffmann, barely 18 years old, crawling forward with a Panzerfaust, the anti-tank weapon that gives foot soldiers a fighting chance against Churchill tanks. Hitler's no-retreat order transforms every Norman village into a miniature Stalingrad. German paratroopers of the 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment dig foxholes in Carentan's rubble, determined to hold the strategic crossroads even as Allied artillery turns medieval stone buildings into powdered limestone. These are the same men who seized Crete from British defenders, elite soldiers who learned their trade jumping into the flames of war. Now, they face their final examination. The sound that haunts every German soldier's nightmares isn't artillery or machine gun fire, it's the distinctive whistle of incoming naval shells. 16-inch guns from Allied battleships can reach 25 kilometers inland, delivering 1,000-pound projectiles that flatten entire city blocks. The psychological impact exceeds even their physical destruction. When the earth shakes beneath your feet and concrete bunkers crumble like sandcastles, you realize you're not fighting soldiers, you're fighting the industrial might of America and Britain. Hauptmann Ernst Müller crouches in a bomb crater that was once Carentan's market square, watching his company, what remains of it, prepare for another Allied assault. His men subsist on looted French eggs and wine when supply convoys fail to reach them, which happens more often than not. Allied fighter bombers patrol every road, turning daylight movement into suicide. German columns travel only at night, feeling their way through darkened villages like blind men navigating a maze. The Wehrmacht's fuel crisis reaches catastrophic proportions. Panzer divisions report tank companies operating at half strength not from battle damage, but from empty gas tanks. Drivers siphon fuel from disabled vehicles to keep their remaining machines running. Some crews abandon perfectly functional tanks rather than leave them for Allied forces, setting thermite charges that turn steel monsters into slag heaps. But the hedgerows give German infantry advantages that numbers and equipment cannot overcome. A single machine gun positioned behind centuries-old stone walls can stop an entire company. Panzerfaust teams hiding in ivy-covered embankments can destroy tanks that cost more than a year's production from entire factories. The bocage turns warfare into a series of violent chess matches, where local knowledge matters more than grand strategy. Weber watches Hoffmann creep closer to the British Sherman, his Panzerfaust balanced across his forearms like a medieval crossbow. The tank commander, visible in his open cupola, scans the hedgerows through binoculars, while his gunner traverses the main gun left and right. They know German infantry lurk nearby, but cannot locate the threat among the green shadows. The Panzerfaust fires with a sharp crack and a puff of white smoke. The shaped charge warhead punches through the Sherman's side armor, and orange flame erupts from every opening. Weber glimpses the tank commander, a young British officer who probably attended Oxford or Cambridge, trying to climb from his burning vehicle before the ammunition cooks off. He doesn't make it. This intimate scale of combat creates psychological trauma that grand strategy ignores. Weber kills men whose faces he can see, whose last words he can hear. The industrial warfare of the Eastern Front, where enemies became statistics at rifle range, gives way to something more personal and infinitely more horrifying. You watch boys your own age die screaming 30 meters away. You smell their blood. You see their mother's photograph scattered in the mud. German medics work miracles with increasingly primitive supplies. Iodine for infections, paper bandages that dissolve in rain. Morphine became a memory months ago, replaced by schnapps and prayer. Wounded soldiers scream until their voices give out, then whimper until they die or heal, usually the former. The smell of gangrene follows German retreats like an invisible fog. Yet somehow, these scattered remnants of Hitler's army continue fighting with effectiveness that surprises even their enemies. A captured German officer tells British interrogators, "We did not lose to men, we lost to your airplanes." It's an admission wrapped in defiance acknowledgement that German soldiers matched Allied troops in ground combat, but could not overcome industrial superiority. The Waffen-SS units present a different kind of problem entirely. They refuse to take prisoners and expect none in return, turning bocage skirmishes into mutual massacres. British and Canadian forces respond with their own brutality, creating a cycle of atrocities that makes the Norman countryside a graveyard of young men's innocence. The Hitler Youth soldiers who once sang patriotic songs around campfires now execute wounded enemies rather than burden themselves with captives. French civilians caught between the armies face impossible choices: collaborate with German occupiers who requisition their food and livestock, or aid Allied forces who bomb their villages to rubble in pursuit of military objectives. Many flee southward, joining streams of refugees that clog roads and complicate military movements on both sides. Weber's machine gun finally falls silent not from mechanical failure, but from exhausted ammunition supplies. He and his surviving squad mates begin their retreat through the hedgerows, moving from shadow to shadow while Allied artillery searches for them with high explosive rounds. Behind them, the Sherman burns like a funeral pyre, sending black smoke into the Norman sky. Could you have maintained Weber's discipline, fighting a retreat through countryside where every field might hide your death, knowing that surrender meant facing charges of war crimes? As German forces fall back toward Caen and Saint-Lô, they leave behind a landscape transformed by warfare, hedgerows torn by explosions, farmhouses reduced to rubble, and fields fertilized with the blood of boys who will never grow old. But the retreat has only begun, and the worst battles lie ahead in the killing fields around Falaise. Section 6. The Desert Fox's Final Gambit. Field Marshal Rommel speeds through the German countryside in his open-topped Horch, the June wind whipping his scarred face as he races toward Normandy, knowing that every kilometre between him and his shattered Atlantic wall brings Germany closer to total defeat. The architect of Fortress Europe returns to find his masterpiece crumbling under Allied hammers, his scattered divisions bleeding out in Norman fields, while Hitler's refusal to face reality transforms tactical setbacks into strategic catastrophe. Rommel has perhaps 48 hours to salvage something from the wreckage or watch the Third Reich die on French beaches. The acrid smell of burning fuel and cordite greets Rommel as his staff car approaches his headquarters at La Roche-Guyon. Black smoke rises from a dozen points along the horizon where Allied fighter bombers have caught German convoys in the open. The roads glitter with broken glass from windshields shattered by strafing runs. Abandoned vehicles line the route trucks, half-tracks, even horse-drawn wagons testimony to Germany's crumbling logistics network. Rommel's aide-de-camp, Captain Helmut Lang, hands him the latest casualty reports. The numbers tell a story of systematic destruction, entire battalions wiped out, regiments reduced to company strength, divisions that exist only on paper. The 716th Static Division overrun at Sword Beach. The 352nd Infantry decimated at Omaha. Unit after unit crossed off the order of battle like items on a shopping list. Mein Herr, Lang ventures carefully. General Speidel requests immediate conference. The situation. He doesn't finish the sentence. Both men understand that euphemism has become meaningless when your army dissolves under enemy fire. But Rommel sees something in the reports that others miss, patterns of German resistance that suggest all is not lost. The 12th SS, Hitlerjugend, has finally engaged Canadian forces around Caen, and their fanatical teenage soldiers fight with effectiveness that shocks Allied commanders. The 21st Panzer, despite losing 60 tanks to air attack, managed a brief counterattack that reached the coast between British landing zones. Scattered actions, but they prove German forces can still bite. The Desert Fox understands what Hitler refuses to acknowledge. This is no feint, no phantom army waits at Calais. The entire weight of Allied industrial might has fallen on Normandy, and Germany must respond with everything available or watch the war slip away in 72 hours. Every hour Hitler spends debating imaginary threats cost lives that can never be recovered. Rommel's staff conference takes place in a medieval castle that has witnessed 8 centuries of warfare, but nothing like this systematic destruction from the skies. Lieutenant General Hans Speidel spreads maps across oak tables where Norman lords once planned their own campaigns. Red pins mark German positions or where German positions used to be. Blue arrows show Allied advances that seem to accelerate with each report. The enemy landed 150,000 men on the 6th, Speidel reports, his voice carefully neutral. Intelligence estimates place current Allied strength at over 200,000, with reinforcements arriving continuously. Our own forces, he pauses, choosing words carefully, our own forces have suffered severe casualties. Rommel studies the map with eyes that have seen defeat before in North Africa, where Montgomery's 8th Army finally cornered the Afrika Korps after 2 years of desert warfare. But this feels different. Worse. In Africa, he fought other soldiers. Here, he fights the combined industrial output of America and Britain, expressed through endless streams of men and materiel that dwarf Germany's remaining resources. The Field Marshal's reputation was built on rapid movement and surprise attack, the Rommel touch, that terrorized British forces from Gazala to El Alamein. But that style of warfare requires fuel, vehicles, and air cover. Germany possesses none of these in sufficient quantities. Allied fighters patrol every road, turning daylight movement into suicide. Supply convoys that once took hours now require days, traveling only at night through countryside swarming with resistance fighters. Rommel's proposed solution reflects desperate innovation. Abandon the coastal fortifications that proved so ineffective, consolidate surviving forces around key transportation hubs, and fight a mobile defense using the bocage terrain. Trade space for time. Force the Allies to pay in blood for every village while German engineers prepare new defensive positions farther inland. But implementation requires Hitler's approval, and Hitler inhabits a fantasy world where admitting tactical failure equals strategic defeat. The Führer's latest orders arrive like messages from an alternate universe. Hold present positions. No withdrawal without express permission. The Atlantic Wall must not be abandoned. Reality has become optional in the Third Reich's command structure. Meanwhile, German soldiers endure the consequences of their leaders' delusions. Artillery crews fire their last shells at targets they cannot see, then retreat with small arms rather than leave their guns for Allied forces. Tank crews abandon perfectly functional panzers rather than drive them without fuel, setting thermite charges that turn million-mark machines into scrap metal. The human cost appears in every field hospital and aid station. German medics treat shrapnel wounds with bandages made from newspaper. They clean infections with looted French wine because medical alcohol disappeared weeks ago. Morphine exists only in memory, replaced by whatever alcohol soldiers can find in abandoned farmhouses. Men scream until their voices break, then die quietly while nurses hold their hands. Rommel dictates orders that try to impose tactical sense on strategic madness. Concentrate the scattered Panzer divisions. Establish new defensive lines behind the Orne River. Evacuate wounded soldiers before Allied artillery finds the field hospitals. But every order must flow through a command structure paralyzed by Hitler's micromanagement and competing authorities that cancel each other's initiatives. The Field Marshal's final gamble takes shape. Convince Hitler that Normandy represents the main Allied effort, not a diversion. Release the 15 divisions guarding Calais. Commit Germany's remaining mobile reserves before Allied forces break out of the bocage into tank country. It's a long shot wrapped in desperation, but Rommel has played long shots before and won. Would you have had the courage to tell Hitler that his intuition was wrong, that the Atlantic Wall had failed, that Germany's only hope lay in admitting defeat and fighting a different kind of war? As evening falls, on June 7th, 1944, Rommel prepares for the most important conversation of his career, a phone call to the Berghof that will determine whether Germany fights smart or dies proud in the hedgerows of Normandy. Section 7. The Wounded Fox. The Spitfire's cannon shells punch through the windshield of Rommel's staff car like steel hornets, spraying glass and blood across the Norman countryside as the Desert Fox slumps unconscious against his driver's shoulder. His war ending not in glorious battle, but in a roadside ditch, 17 kilometers from Livorot. Germany's most celebrated field commander lies broken on French soil, while his leaderless armies disintegrate under relentless Allied pressure, their retreat becoming a rout that will trap 200,000 Wehrmacht soldiers in a pocket of death near Falaise. The man who might have salvaged something from Hitler's strategic madness now fights for his life in a military hospital while the Third Reich bleeds to death around him. The metallic taste of blood fills Rommel's mouth as consciousness flickers in and out like a damaged radio. Through swollen eyes, he glimpses his driver, Sergeant Daniel, slumped over the steering wheel, his field-grey uniform soaked crimson. The smell of gasoline and cordite mingles with the sweet scent of Norman wheat, crushed beneath their overturned haunch. In the distance, aircraft engines drone overhead, more Allied fighters hunting German columns like wolves pursuing wounded deer. Captain Lang drags his field marshal from the wreckage, checking for broken bones while blood streams from Rommel's fractured skull. The man who conquered Tobruk and terrorized British forces from Gazala to El Alamein now weighs no more than a child in his aide's arms. "Stay with me, Herr Feldmarschall," Lang whispers, though he knows the Desert Fox cannot hear him through the fog of concussion and trauma. The timing couldn't be worse. Operation Cobra, the American breakout at Saint-Lô, explodes across German lines just as Rommel disappears from command. General Fritz Bayerlein's Panzer Lehr division, already bled white by weeks of bocage fighting, disintegrates under the weight of 3,000 Allied bombers that carpet the countryside with high explosive. Entire companies vanish in clouds of pulverized earth and shattered steel. Without Rommel's tactical brilliance to coordinate defense, German commanders revert to Hitler's suicidal, hold-at-all-costs orders. Isolated units fight to extinction rather than conduct organized retreats. The flexible defense that might have bought time for negotiated peace becomes a series of last stands that accomplish nothing beyond adding names to casualty lists. Lieutenant Colonel Kurt Meyer, the boy general commanding what remains of the 12th SS Hitlerjugend, receives reports that read like horror fiction. His division, once 15,000 strong, can muster barely 3,000 effective soldiers. The teenagers who sang patriotic songs on their march to Normandy now huddle in shell craters, their Hitler Youth armbands torn and blood-stained, their faith in ultimate victory shattered like their bones. Meyer himself embodies the tragedy of Germany's child soldiers. At 33, he's considered ancient by his surviving troops boys who enlisted at 16 and aged decades in weeks of combat. He watches them load their last magazines with hands that shake from exhaustion rather than fear. They've moved beyond fear, into a realm where death becomes preferable to continued suffering. The German retreat becomes a nightmare of burning vehicles and abandoned equipment. Panzer crews push their disabled tanks off roads rather than leave them intact for Allied forces. Supply trucks explode in mushroom clouds of flame as drivers detonate their cargo before fleeing on foot. The Wehrmacht's carefully maintained logistics network dissolves into chaos as every movement draws strafing runs from Allied aircraft. German field hospitals overflow with casualties that overwhelm medical supplies non-existent since May. Doctors perform amputations without anesthesia, using carpenter's saws when surgical instruments break. Nurses 16 years old hold dying soldiers while reciting prayers in languages the wounded don't understand. The smell of gangrene follows German retreats like an invisible plague. French civilians trapped between the armies face impossible choices that will haunt them forever. Hide German deserters and face Allied bombardment, aid retreating Wehrmacht units and risk execution as collaborators. The Norman countryside becomes a moral maze where survival requires compromising principles that once seemed absolute. In his hospital bed, Rommel drifts between consciousness and delirium, his fractured mind replaying battles from North Africa where warfare still possessed rules and honor. He dreams of tank duels at dawn, of British officers who saluted captured Germans, of a war fought between professionals rather than ideological fanatics. Those days died somewhere in the Russian steppes, leaving only the current brutality where children kill children for causes they barely understand. The military situation deteriorates with mathematical precision. German casualty reports climb past 80,000 killed, wounded, and missing during June alone. Entire divisions cease to exist. Regiment-sized formations shrink to company strength. The Wehrmacht's order of battle becomes a fiction maintained by staff officers who lack the courage to report reality to Berlin. Hitler's response to each catastrophic report remains unchanged. Hold present positions, expect relief from wonder weapons that exist only in fevered imaginations, trust that American and British resolve will crack under the weight of casualties that Germany can no longer inflict. The Führer inhabits a parallel universe where battlefield reality cannot penetrate the bubble of sycophancy surrounding his Alpine retreat. General Günther von Kluge-Rommel's replacement as Army Group B commander arrives in Normandy expecting to find an army capable of counterattack. Instead, he discovers the remnants of formations that exist primarily on paper, commanded by officers too exhausted to maintain military courtesy, supplied by a logistics network that has collapsed under sustained air assault. Von Kluge's first battlefield inspection becomes an education in the new arithmetic of warfare. German infantry companies report strength of 30 men instead of 180. Panzer battalions field 6 operational tanks instead of 45. Artillery batteries possess ammunition for one day's combat rather than sustained operations. The numbers don't lie, even when the leadership refuses to believe them. Would you have had the moral courage to continue fighting when your cause was clearly lost? Or would survival instinct have driven you to seek surrender despite the likely consequences? As July fades into August, the trap begins closing around German forces in Normandy, a pocket of death near Falaise, where 200,000 Wehrmacht soldiers will face annihilation while their greatest field commander lies unconscious in a hospital bed, powerless to save them from the consequences of Hitler's strategic madness. Section 8. The Falaise Graveyard. Obergefreiter Hans Kruger crouches behind a shattered stone wall as Canadian artillery tears through the village of Chambois, each explosion showering him with fragments of medieval masonry, while 200,000 German soldiers fight for their lives in a shrinking pocket that has become Europe's largest graveyard. The trap that began with D-Day now snaps shut around the remnants of Hitler's Western Army, their retreat routes severed by Allied pincers that transform organized withdrawal into panicked flight through killing fields, where survival depends more on luck than skill. What started as tactical defeat has become strategic catastrophe, the final collapse of German power in France. Kruger tastes blood and stone dust as he peers through gaps in the rubble, watching Canadian Sherman tanks advance methodically through streets where Wehrmacht soldiers once marched in victory formation 4 years earlier. The irony isn't lost on him. The same roads that carried German conquest now channel their destruction. Behind him, scattered remnants of half a dozen divisions stream eastward in vehicles, on foot, or slung across the backs of horses requisitioned from Norman farms. The mathematics of encirclement are brutally simple. General Omar Bradley's First Army drives north from the Cobra breakout. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's forces push south from Caen. Between these closing jaws, German Army Group B disintegrates under constant attack from ground and air. The pocket shrinks hourly as Allied artillery finds every crossroads, every bridge, every potential escape route. What remains of German command structure reads like a casualty list. Rommel lies in a hospital bed, his skull fractured by Allied strafing. General Friedrich Dollmann committed suicide rather than face court-martial for losing Cherbourg. Panzer Lehr's Fritz Bayerlein commands a division that exists only in name, its tanks reduced to scrap metal by carpet bombing. The Wehrmacht's leadership cadre, built over decades, bleeds to death in Norman hedgerows. Kruger watches a column of German vehicles attempt to cross the Dives River, under cover of morning fog. Allied fighter bombers appear within minutes, their rockets turning trucks into funeral pyres and half-tracks into twisted metal. Wounded soldiers scream as ammunition cooks off in burning vehicles. Others stumble from wrecked convoys with clothes aflame, rolling in muddy ditches to extinguish fires that will leave them scarred forever. The smell of death permeates everything. Corpses of men and horses lie bloating in summer heat, their stench mixing with cordite smoke and burning fuel. French civilians flee southward in carts loaded with possessions, their faces blank with shock at the destruction unleashed in their peaceful countryside. Some pause to help wounded German soldiers. Others pass by with eyes fixed ahead, unwilling to risk involvement in others' tragedies. German propaganda broadcasts maintain their alternate reality even as the army dies. Radio announcers describe tactical withdrawals to prepared positions, while Wehrmacht units cease to exist as organized formations. Goebbels's ministry reports successful defensive operations, while German survivors struggle through fields littered with their comrades' bodies. The disconnect between official narrative and battlefield truth becomes total. In scattered command posts, often nothing more than shell holes with radio equipment, German officers face impossible decisions. Obey Hitler's no-retreat orders and watch their men die uselessly, or attempt breakout operations that might save some lives while guaranteeing their own execution for disobedience. Most choose a middle path, fighting delaying actions while gradually withdrawing eastward, hoping higher command will eventually acknowledge reality. The human cost appears in every aid station where German medics work miracles with supplies that would have been considered inadequate for peacetime training exercises. Bandages made from torn clothing, surgical instruments cleaned with gasoline when alcohol runs out, operations performed without anesthesia while patients bite wooden sticks to avoid screaming. Many wounded soldiers die not from their injuries but from infections that proper medical supplies would have prevented. Kruger's unit, what remains of the 352nd Infantry Division that defended Omaha Beach, has lost 80% of its strength since June 6th. The survivors move like sleepwalkers through a landscape transformed by industrial warfare, villages reduced to rubble, forests stripped bare by artillery, fields cratered like lunar terrain. This is what happens when modern armies collide at full strength. The earth itself bears scars that will last generations. German soldiers adapt with desperate ingenuity. They travel only at night, navigating by stars and compass when roads become death traps. They abandon vehicles rather than risk daylight movement, continuing on foot through countryside swarming with Allied reconnaissance units. They strip equipment from dead comrades, taking ammunition and medical supplies with clinical efficiency born of necessity. The Falaise Pocket becomes a case study in how modern warfare destroys not just armies but entire societies. French farms burn as artillery sets haystacks ablaze. Livestock wander through abandoned villages, their owners fled or dead. Children grow up overnight as they witness horrors that would have been unimaginable months earlier. The social fabric of rural Normandy tears apart under the weight of mechanized destruction. Some German units maintain discipline until the end. SS formations fight with fanatical determination, refusing surrender even when ammunition runs out. Paratroopers establish defensive positions in village ruins and hold them until overwhelmed by superior numbers. Tank crews ram their disabled panzers into Allied vehicles rather than abandon them intact. These final acts of defiance accomplish nothing tactically, but preserve some shred of military honor in the midst of comprehensive defeat. Others simply collapse. Entire battalions dissolve as soldiers discard weapons and walk eastward with hands raised. Officers shoot themselves rather than face capture and interrogation. Supply units burn their vehicles and join streams of refugees heading anywhere except toward the sound of guns. The Wehrmacht's vaunted discipline finally cracks under pressures no army could sustain indefinitely. As August sunlight filters through smoke clouds that have covered Normandy for weeks, Kruger makes his final decision. Behind him lies the burning wreckage of Hitler's Western Army. Ahead stretches open country, where Allied tanks wait to complete the slaughter. He removes his helmet, raises his hands, and walks toward the Canadian lines, another statistic in the greatest military disaster of the war. Picture yourself in that moment, surrounded, outnumbered, watching everything you believed in crumble into ash and blood. Would you have continued fighting for a lost cause, or chosen survival over ideology? The Falaise pocket closes on August 21st, 1944, trapping 50,000 German soldiers and killing or wounding 130,000 more. The remnants of 21 divisions cease to exist. Hitler's Atlantic Wall becomes a graveyard, stretching from the Norman beaches to the killing fields around Falaise, marking the end of German power in Western Europe and the beginning of the Third Reich's final collapse.